So we're delighted to have Steve Roach with us today. Before I introduce him, I want to take a moment to provide a little context for our conversation. Today's program is the fourth in a series we've been presenting on the global economy and looking ahead to 2015. So I was just saying to someone, if we're in the new normal, this is part of our effort to understand not only where we are today, but where we're heading. What kind of a world, economically speaking, can we all start to look forward to? This series has been designed with corporate, business, professional communities of Chicago very much in mind to help answer, we hope, or at least provide some insight on very critical questions for that community. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our series co-sponsors, Monitor and Career Builder. They've been valuable partners with us in the effort. And I would like to thank as well the CFA Society of Chicago for its support in putting together this wonderful audience that we have for Stephen Roach. I think many of you probably know that tomorrow evening we have another excellent opportunity to learn about the global economy, and that is an evening with Jim Wolfenson, the former president of the World Bank, among many other formers, who will be with us to discuss the global economy in the wake of the crisis. I spent 20 years at the Asia Society in New York before I came to Chicago, now almost 10 years ago. And I was reminding Steve that we met at least on many occasions during that time. I don't remember, frankly, the first time. When in his role at Morgan Stanley, he early on, before it was popular in the commentariat even, not to mention in the broader public discourse, the importance of the rise of Asia. He made good on his predictions. He put his body where his beliefs were and took himself to Asia a few years back, and in 2007 in particular, where as the bank's chief economist, he commented even more regularly to benefit of all of us about what was happening in the region just as the financial crisis hit. He continues to be non-executive chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, but he has embarked on a new career, if you will, in academia at Yale University as senior lecturer in the School of Management and senior fellow in Yale's new Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. His research, as well as his extraordinary prolific writing, covers globalization, the emergence of China and Asia as a whole, key issues of productivity, macroeconomic impacts, information technology, technological change in general, and a variety of other topics. In his latest book, The Next Asia, which I should mention I used Steve in my course I just finished teaching at Northwestern on the rise of Asia. He covers all these topics and more, and I urge the book to your attention. His work has appeared in academic journals, but also very familiarly to all of us on the op-ed pages of every leading newspaper and important journal in the world. Our moderator this afternoon, who will discuss these issues with Steve Roach, is Michael Moskow. Of course, the vice chairman and senior fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for Global Economy. Mike is known to all of us here in Chicago as a great civic leader in his role as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and in many other roles, including, I'm very proud to say, those he now plays with us at the Chicago Council. During the course of his distinguished career, Mike was confirmed by the United States Senate for 5 U.S. government positions. In 1991, President Bush appointed him the Deputy United States Trade Representative with the rank of ambassador. And he played a key role in trade negotiations with Asia at that time, particularly Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. And we're delighted that he is with us and will conduct this interview with Steve Roach today. A brief comment on the format. Steve will deliver some prepared remarks from the podium, and following those remarks, Michael will join him on the stage and they will have a discussion, and after that, as is always our custom, we will take questions from all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Roach.
Thank you very much, Marshall. Your remarks are far too kind. Thanks to all of you for coming to join us in this rather intimate setting. It's not often that I get to speak on a stage where a Christmas tree is peering over the top, but happy holidays to all of you as well. We certainly gather at truly fascinating times to discuss the issues that are in front of us in trying to assess the prospects for the global economy. 2 years after this horrific crisis and a very severe recession, it's tempting to breathe a sigh of relief. Markets are up again today, and even though there are problems that appear to linger, like a 9.8% unemployment rate in this country, there's hope at this time of the year, as there was this time of the year last year, that a recovery and healing is in sight. I'm not here to really throw cold water on that, but to try to put where we are in the context of where we've been and some of the unfinished business that still needs to be addressed in assessing the prospects for the broader world economy. The title of my talk pretty much says it all, and there's some questions that are posed just by the title that I have selected today. Post-crisis world. Are we really in a post-crisis world? That appears to be the case in the United States. A little over 2 years after the worst of the Lehman-related pyrotechnics, but certainly is not the case in Europe, where European nations, large and small, core and peripheral, are enmeshed in a really serious sovereign debt crisis. Is there a linkage between what's going on in Europe and what went on in the U.S. a couple of years ago? Absolutely, in my view. I don't think this European debt crisis would have really unfolded had it not been for the recession-induced shortfall in economic activity that blew up budget deficits in countries like Greece and Ireland and Spain and Portugal and the like. So the post-crisis world is not something you can draw a fine line in demarking the beginning or the end. This particular crisis was a long time in coming, and I suspect will be a long time in unfolding, and it's going to be bumpy along the road. A year ago at this time, it felt terrific. The markets were ending the year 2009 on a strong note, and yet we had a series of very serious growth scares along the way over the course of 2010. Will it be that way in 2011? Will it be that way in 2012? Those are the issues that I want to address with you today. And the word pitfalls is simply designed to say, just be cautious in concluding that the worst, in fact, is over. There's in the aftermath of a crisis like this, you have to learn to expect the unexpected. I'm going to show you a few slides. I guess I have that coded into my DNA. Even though I'm now spending more time in academia than on Wall Street, I mean, I think once you get hardwired to do PowerPoint, it's hard to break the habit. For those of you who can't see the slides, I think we have handouts on your chair. I see that most of you are sitting on them. That's fine too. You can leave them there if you want. It's a pretty big screen. I think there are three big issues that the world needs to come to grip with before we can truly give a green light on this post-crisis era. And that's the bulk of what I want to talk to you about today. And they pertain to three very different but ultimately interrelated imbalances that are global in scope. My thesis on the global economy, for what it's worth, is that the crisis that came to a head in September of 2008 was a reflection of imbalances that have been building in many different dimensions of the global economy for a number of years. Imbalances on the demand side, imbalances on the supply side, and imbalances in terms of the formulation and conduct of policies, fiscal, monetary, and currency. And I think it's important to address each of these imbalances in turn, and then to try to get a sense of how they fit together in shaping the world over the next few years. This first slide gives you an example of the imbalances that exist on the demand side of the global economy. We show you just levels of consumption for 5 economies, or in the case of Europe, region. And you can see for yourself the stunning mismatch between the United States, for example, 4.5% of the world's population, but a $10 trillion consumer. Contrast that with China and India on the right. Combined population, 37% of the world, combined consumption, about $2.5 trillion. So I am hugely optimistic on consumer demand prospects in China and India, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But they don't have the scale in any way whatsoever to compensate for any shortfalls from the biggest consumer in the world, the American consumer. And if you add in the European consumer, and I'm not particularly optimistic on the European consumer, you've got an even tougher set of headwinds bearing down on consumers globally. The American consumer, though, is likely to be the biggest trend breaker relative to consumer spending developments over the broad course of the last 15 years. In the pre-crisis period, there was a dozen years when the growth of U.S. consumer spending in inflation-adjusted terms was close to 4% a year. We've never had a spending surge for a sustained period of time that ever came close to that, and it's over, done. And it's over and done because consumers during that great binge spent beyond their means, drew down their household savings rates to a number very close to zero, went into record levels of indebtedness, and borrowed heavily against what turned out to be, unfortunately for many Americans, an asset bubble. The bubbles have popped. The income growth is weak. The American labor market is in an acute state of distress. And so American consumers are now embarked on what I believe will be a multi-year process of rebuilding saving, paying down debt. Economists call it deleveraging. You can call it whatever you want. It's not going to be anything close to the trend growth of nearly 4% a year we saw for a dozen years before the crisis. And that's a big shift, especially when you look at it in the context of a slide like this. You have to ask yourself, who is going to fill the void? My answer to you is no one. There are no guarantees, because one of those bars goes down, another one has to go up. Europe certainly is a case in point where the Europeans have this horrific debt crisis. They have massive fiscal deficit problems. And unlike America, where all we do to a fiscal deficit problem is just make it worse and kick the can down the road, they seem to be fairly serious in bringing their fiscal conditions into some semblance of order, and they've announced fairly major deficit reduction programs over the next few years, which will take a hit on their economy and certainly create some significant headwinds for the European consumer. Japan, I don't think, is a particularly strong case to offset anyone's void here. Japan certainly has major ongoing issues of their own. They've just gone through 2 lost decades, and there's a compelling case why there may be a third. So the demand side of the world remains today acutely unbalanced, and the biggest source of the imbalance over the past 15 years has been the American consumer. And it looks to me that the American consumer is going to pull back a lot. The Chinese consumer, as I will tell you shortly, is going to begin to rise up in a very vigorous way. But the scale effects, the differential between China and the U.S. Are profound, and it'll be a long, long time before you can expect increases in Chinese consumption to make up the difference. But this depicts a very unbalanced state of affairs on the demand side of the global economy, and it definitely needs rebalancing. That process has only just begun. Now, the supply side has an equally profound set of imbalances, and there I'm going to use my favorite economy in the world, China, to illustrate the nature of the beast here. What you see on this slide are shares of the Chinese economy, shares of the GDP. On the left are the 2 sectors that have driven what is truly a miracle in the broad sweep of economic development over the past 30 years. 2 sectors, exports and investment. Back in 1979, not that long ago, the Chinese economy was on the brink of collapse. Post-Cultural Revolution, the economy was truly at risk of imploding. And there was a very difficult leadership transition at the end of the Cultural Revolution after the death of Mao. Deng Xiaoping emerged, made a solid commitment to an investment and export-led opening up and reform, to use the jargon of the Chinese. And they put the full force of their state-directed system to work in generating 30 years of 10% growth, a tenfold increase in their income per head, per capita, over that period. I've studied economic development for a long, long time. There has never been in the modern annals of economic development even close to what the Chinese have pulled off. But as miraculous as it was not sustainable. The premier of China, Wen Jiabao, 3.5 years ago, before the crisis, made what turned out to be very prescient set of remarks when he said, on the surface, everything appears to be strong in China, but beneath the surface, he was worried about a Chinese economy that was increasingly unstable, unbalanced, to quote his words, uncoordinated and unsustainable. How right he was. Look at what happened during the crisis and recession of 2008. The red line, the export line, China's most dynamic source of economic growth, went from boom to bust in 7 months. In July of 2007, export growth in China was still plus 26% year on year. 7 months later, it was minus 27 in February of 2009. The GDP growth slowed to a standstill. The government admitted over 20 million migrant workers in one province, export-led Guangdong province, had lost their jobs. China was in the functional equivalent of a major recession. This is China's wake-up call. This is China's a warning shot that the model for 30 years, while it's heavily dependent on what they can do to improve their competitiveness on the supply side of the global economy, they are hostage to the state of global demand. And the slide I just showed you before tells you not all is well on the global demand front. And so it's time to change the model in accordance with what the Premier warned about 3.5 years ago. And the challenge for China is to understand what it's going to take basically to move the model from the chart on the left to the chart on the right, a model driven by the sector that's been on the outside looking in, the Chinese consumer, whose share of Chinese GDP at 36% is half that in the United States. I think they're going to do it. And in fact, the way China operates, they still use this Soviet-style 5-year planning structure, and they have just approved the next 5-year plan. It's the 12th 5-year plan that will take effect in February of 2011. And I think it is going to be a watershed event for China, for the rest of Asia and the world. It'll be a plan that makes an enormous effort to deal with the shortfall on the right. And briefly, what this plan will do is set out 3 goals to jumpstart Chinese consumption. Number 1, to reduce excess savings. The savings rate of Chinese families is high and rising because they're scared. They have no social safety net, they have no social security, private pensions, unemployment, medical insurance. All these plans exist on paper, but they're not funded, and they don't give Chinese people the sense of security they need to draw down excessive saving. Number 2, they have massive problems of income inequality. Today, per capita income in the urban areas in China is at a record 3.3 times that of the average per capita income in rural China. Inequalities are bad and they're getting worse. Very much at odds with what the government calls, in typical sort of socialist language, the harmonious society. And the best way to address that is to provide policies that provide a lot of support to rural incomes, tax policies, land ownership reforms, and aggressive rural-urban migration in China. And they will do that. It's in the 12th 5-year plan, as are the provisions to fund the safety net. And finally, labor absorption. Even today, with all the development that's occurred in China, still some 740 million Chinese live in the countryside at impoverished income levels. And they need to provide gainful employment in higher wage occupations, and they can't do it with the manufacturing economy, because the manufacturing economy is amazingly efficient in terms of substituting machines for people. It's a labor-saving growth model, And the sector that's been missing in action from China is labor-intensive services, and there's a number of initiatives in this new plan to remedy that. So this is the plan, or at least a broad outline of the plan. People tell me, they say, oh, Asians are programmed at birth to save. This is a DNA issue. It's going to take decades and generations to change it. I'm here to tell you, don't believe it for a second. The Chinese respond to incentives. Everything I've seen them do on the development front, they do at hyper speed. When they are committed to a program, the results will exceed anything that we in the West can anticipate. Look for it. The consumption share of GDP will start rising in China very shortly. And by the way, it's a huge opportunity for those of us who need sources of growth in the West. Selling in to what will be the world's greatest consumption story will be an extraordinary opportunity for us in the U.S. Don't ever forget, China is our third largest export market right now, right behind Canada and Mexico, and by far our most rapidly growing. The final thing, or the final issue I want to address before I join Michael in a discussion is unrelated to the supply and demand imbalances, to talk about policy imbalances. And in particular, I'm very concerned about the formulation and recent developments on the policy front in the United States. And I say that with respect to fiscal policy, monetary policy, and currency policy. I think our policy problems actually started a long, long time ago. We should have seen the handwriting on the wall when we saw what happened to Japan in the late 80s when they allowed their economy to get infected by some massive bubbles, equities and property. The bubbles burst and the Japanese economy has never been the same since. And we allowed that to happen in the United States as well. And actually, we upped the ante in terms of the impacts it had on our economy vis-a-vis the Japanese economy. The one sector of the Japanese economy that got blown up the most during the late 80s, during their bubble period, was business capital spending, which surged to a then unprecedented 20% of the Japanese GDP and then was collapsed and was cut in half. During our bubble period, we had two sectors, home building activity and consumer demand, which collectively surged to 76% of GDP before the bubbles burst in 07 and 08. So the segment of our economy that was distorted by bubbles was basically 4 times that which was affected by the bubbles in Japan. Unlike Japan, though, we have a different value proposition. Our political system, our social values do not endure these long periods of post-bubble correction that the Japanese are going through now some 20 years later. We want and demand out of our elected leaders instant gratification. This is America. We want the quick fix. And our policymakers, unfortunately, are doing exactly what the American mentality is demanding here. Monetary policy, we got QE2, and if that doesn't work, you're going to get QE3. You're going to get a whole fleet of ships just launched, throwing a lot of money at a consumer who wants to pay down debt and rebuild saving. I don't think it's going to work for a second. We can talk about that in discussion with somebody who knows a lot more about monetary policy than I do. The fiscal issues, trillion-dollar budget deficits as far as the eye can see. And if they weren't bad enough, we just cut a deal between the White House and the Congress to add another $857 billion to the deficit to deal with whatever the tax issues and other seemingly important issues over the short term, but they throw the long-term fiscal equation into serious disarray. And the one issue on the policy front that I will just bore into a little bit that I'm particularly nervous about is not only are we making mistakes on monetary policy and fiscal policy, but we're very close to a slippery slope on currency policy with our penchant to blame China for the problems that are bearing down on American workers. And this will be the final picture that I show you. There's one after this, but I'm running out of time, and it's actually my best slide, but I'm not going to talk about it. The House of Representatives on September the 29th, by a margin of 4-1 in their infinite wisdom, passed a bill that would allow American companies to seek remedy in the form of trade sanctions imposed on all Chinese products sold in the United States as compensation for an undervalued, quote, manipulated currency. The idea that lies behind this is that there's obviously an acute amount of distress in the U.S. labor market, and at the same time, there's an enormous trade deficit that America has. The biggest piece of that is with China. The Chinese, quote, manipulate their currency. It's very undervalued, and we must be aggressive in urging them to change that policy. Again, there's huge bipartisan political support for this sentiment. Republicans and Democrats agree on very little these days, but they do agree on holding China responsible. And there's a lot of support for that type of remedy from very prominent academics as well. I will not name names here, but there's one in particular who has a beard. He writes a column for the New York Times on Mondays and Fridays. And he believes, with his pedigree of a Nobel Prize, that the Chinese currency is right now costing America at least 1.5 million jobs. There's a good chance that this bill will come up for a vote in the Senate and could easily pass by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in early 2011. And my take on President Obama is he's not in a mood to take on the Senate and the House that have such broad bipartisan support for legislation like this. I happen to think that this whole approach is dead wrong. What this slide shows you is, yes, America has a trade deficit with China, but it also has a trade deficit with 89 other countries. We have a multilateral problem. We don't have a bilateral problem. And the reason we have a multilateral problem is because we do not save as a nation. If you add up the savings in America from individuals, businesses, and the government sector and subtract out the depreciation which goes to the wear and tear of our capital stock, our net national savings rate went into negative territory in 2008 and was a minus 2.3% of GDP last year. No leading country in the history of the world has ever had a negative net national savings rate. Lacking in saving, we import surplus savings from abroad in order to grow, and we run a massive balance of payments deficit and multilateral trade deficits with 90 countries. Shut down trade with China, the Chinese piece goes somewhere else to a higher cost producer, which ends up taxing the American worker. There is no bilateral fix for a multilateral trade imbalance, and yet it's very convenient in a nation like ours where the political process puts such a premium on the urgency for the quick fix. So I've droned on enough. What I believe strongly is that there's still a lot of unfinished business in the post-crisis world. The imbalances that got us into trouble on the demand side are still there. We're starting a long and arduous process of working our way through them. The imbalances on the supply side are still present. China is the dominant force on the supply side, and they are about to embark on a dramatic rebalancing of our own. The imbalances on the policy side are most immediate and most worrying, especially in the United States, where our system demands a very, very quick fix. And I worry on that basis that we're still playing with fire. Thank you very much.
Steve, that's a great job. Thank you very much. I too want to thank you for being here today, and thank you for your very helpful comments. And I know this audience was listening very carefully to every word, every syllable of what you were saying. So let me go back to a couple of things you've said, just for some clarification here. One of your key points is this change that's going to take place in China now, from being such a heavy percentage of their GDP in investment, over 40%, and shifting more to consumption. Of course, this is something that's been discussed for quite some time. This is not new. U.S. policymakers who've traveled to China over the last decade have been encouraging this, and the Chinese have often said, yeah, we're going to do it. But you now think they're serious about it. Is it what makes you think now that they're going to do it when they haven't done it over the last years?
No, this is a fair point, Michael, and this is something I personally have been hectoring the Chinese on myself for a long time. But at the end of the day, they are extremely pragmatic in the way they go about figuring out how to keep growing at the rate they need to grow at to maintain social stability. If there's one phrase that has always shaped my perceptions of what's most important in China, it is their emphasis on social stability. They will do nothing that raises concerns on that regard. That's by way of backdrop to saying the crisis and the post-crisis aftershocks that I discussed in my remarks are a huge alarm bell for China. They draw into question the assumption that has supported their export business for 30 years, vigorous growth in global demand. And if the shock of a dramatic pullback in the American consumer was not enough in late '08 and early '09, now the aftershocks of what's going on in Europe, I think, has convinced them beyond a shadow of a doubt that the external demand for goods assembled and made in China is going to be growing at a much slower pace in the years ahead. So if they want to maintain 10% growth or 8% growth, whatever the number is, they're not going to get the tailwinds from the global environment that they have become accustomed to. So they've got to find a new source of demand. And that's where the consumer comes into the equation. This is the sector that's been, again, on the outside looking in, and it's their only choice.
So assuming they are able to make this transition, what do you think the biggest risk is? What could go wrong in the Chinese economy?
Look, there's a cottage industry of China doubters that put out a book, I think, every week on what could go wrong. The social upheaval, the banking crisis, the bad loans that have been made at the local government level recently, property bubbles, you name it, pollution, I think there's a lot that can go wrong in China, but over the last 30 years, those doubts have surfaced repeatedly, and the Chinese have been able to sustain growth and deal with those issues in a way that has surprised virtually everyone. If I were to think about two things that would be the biggest risk ultimately to what I told you on China, they would be, number one, I could be wrong on the global economy. Let's just say the U.S. consumer comes flying back, and QE2 was just a brilliant move, and forget about debt and savings. Americans just start spending, and the global economy catches fire, and the demand on the external side for Chinese exports just goes back to the way it was. Then what's the urgency to change? That's number one. I don't believe that, but you have to always ask yourself, how could you be wrong? Number two would be, take the consumer model as we know it in the United States and look inside of the value proposition that really shapes consumer society. Upward mobility, free and open communication, basically an aspirational value structure. Can it really come to fruition without political reform in China? And ultimately, I think there is a point of reckoning at some point down the road between the political structures that exist in China today with a more mature and open consumer society, and I do worry about that.
So even in an authoritarian-led country, the leaders have to be somewhat responsive to the people in the country to stay in power, even though they have the army behind them.
I think so.
At some point, they have to.
I mean, the Premier, Wen Jiabao, who I spoke of in my comments, actually gave a number of speeches this year on political reform in China. And it caused quite a buzz inside of China. And then there was, something, harkens right back to the Cultural Revolution. There was an editorial written in the leading Communist Party newspaper, the People's Daily, written that was very critical and signed by one of these cryptic pseudonyms. And Wen Jiabao hasn't given a speech on political reform since then.
You haven't mentioned anything about inflation in China, and I know there is concern about that. The published numbers are over 4%. People think that's really understated. There's an article in the paper the other day about Walmart. If they want to raise prices in their stores, they have to get permission from the government. They have to notify them 48 hours in advance in order to get permission to raise prices. So how do you, and obviously with an economy growing that quickly, 8 to 10% a year, there's always this risk that inflation could get really out of control. How do you feel about that?
I think that there is a short-term cyclical inflation problem in China right now. Actually, over the weekend, they published the November CPI, and it went up to 5.1. So it's even higher than you might think. And you're right; it's possible that number could be understated. The bulk of the acceleration over the last year has been in the food area, which is, at the Fed. As you know, Michael, the Fed likes to strip out, bad things and create these core indexes.
Well, they're
CPIs.
not always bad now.
Yeah. Well, now it's working the other way. But when I was at the Fed, we had this Fed chairman, Arthur Burns, who forced us to take all the bad things out, and ultimately we took out about 80% of the CPI, and it was still bad. But in any case, that's another. What was your question? Oh yeah, there is an inflation problem in China, whether it's food or non-food, and the government about 10 days ago issued a cryptic statement that actually looked like it could have been written by Alan Greenspan, where they said we are shifting monetary policy our stance from being moderately loose, which was the operative words they used during the crisis, to prudent. Now, who the heck knows what prudent is? But if you sort of calculate the difference between those two adjectives, to me it sounds like a tightening. And then there were expectations that the People's Bank of China would hike interest rates over the weekend, especially in light of the really rough November CPI report, and they didn't do it. And that's worrisome. I would urge them, and I was in Beijing last week, and I said very clearly to the Chinese officials that you can't wait. You've got to be early and aggressive in dealing with inflation, because if you're late, then you have to do a lot of tightening, and you do have a risk of a hard landing, which is a much slower growth rate in the Chinese economy, and that would make it really very hard to then execute these big policies to change the structure of the economy. So I agree with you that they do have an inflation problem right now, and they do appear to be at risk in falling behind the curve. They've chosen to deal with inflation by these administrative measures that you alluded to, with the sort of permissioning a la Walmart. They've also been hiking bank reserve ratios to cut down excessive loan growth, but they've got to use interest rates as well, and they're much more reluctant to do that.
And of course, these decisions in China are made by the leaders of the Communist Party. They're not made by an independent central bank.
No, they're the Politburo, and most of these guys, well, there's a few of them that sort of understand the macro issues, but there are a lot of them who don't.
Let me shift to the last part of your comments about your concern about protectionism in the United States and possibility of this legislation being enacted, which I certainly agree with you would be a terrible mistake. But there have been, a few rays of hope in the last couple of weeks in this area. One is that the U.S. has negotiated a free trade agreement with South Korea, which I think is something long overdue, but we're delighted it's done. And the second is this World Trade Organization decision just recently on tires, where the U.S. challenged China, raised tariffs. China took us to the WTO. The WTO ruled in our favor on that. So do you think possibly these could reduce the pressure for protectionist legislation in the United States?
I hope so. I mean, I share with you, I think the breakthrough on the Korea free trade deal is encouraging, although, we still have to make sure this gets through the U.S. Congress. And that is always problematic in a period with very high unemployment in the United States. I still worry that early next year, when the new Congress gets together, that there will be pressure to bring the House bill to a vote in the Senate. There was actually some pressure in the last 48 hours to attach the House bill as an amendment to the fiscal deal that was just agreed upon. And fortunately, the leadership of the Senate was able to disallow that from happening. I think if the unemployment rate remains high, and I think it will, certainly in early 2011, that you just can't rule that out. And I think it would be a horrible mistake.
Yeah, well, it's unlikely the unemployment rate is going to be, in the U.S. is going to be coming down anytime soon, given the state of the economy and the huge number of people who are outside the workforce. As they come into the workforce, as you know, that's going to put upward pressure on the unemployment rate here. Let me ask you one other question about China that's really not basically an economic question, but it's about North Korea, which I know you've observed China very carefully over the years you've traveled there. So I'd be interested in your views on the relationship between China and North Korea and the U.S. and whether you see, how you see this all evolving in the coming years.
Well, that's a great question. First of all, there is no mistaking the fact that China over the past year and a half has been more aggressive in geopolitical security issues in the broad Asian theater than they have been for a long time. Whether it is the role they play or they don't play in North Korea, the disputed Japanese islands and the tit-for-tat embargo on rare earth exports, or their rather adventuresome policy in the South China Sea. These are all, I think, emblematic of a different stance on the part of China that is clearly causing a fair amount of consternation in Asian and U.S. Security circles. What's it mean? I don't think anybody knows right now. There's two obvious strains of thought here. One, it's a reflection of a China that feels itself that it's getting somewhat stronger on the economic front, and is now at a position where that strength also translates into a willingness to project greater power in the region. And unrelated to that, but part of the same equation, is their sense that the U.S., the greatest military power in the world, is now a weakened economic power, and so they put those two together. In terms of your specific question on Korea, my sense in talking to security experts in this country as well as in China is that the last thing the Chinese want is a unified Korean peninsula that could, under certain circumstances, unleash a torrent of refugees from the north into China, but also, more importantly, in the eyes of the Chinese, allow a large force of American military to be very close to their border. The Chinese still view North Korea as a sort of in the Cold War mindset, as a buffer between the West and the mainland. I personally think that's completely antiquated, but they haven't really brought me into those negotiations.
So it seems as if we're going in completely U.S. and China are going in completely opposite directions here, and it doesn't sound like you're very optimistic that the two of us would reach any agreement on North Korea in the future.
Yeah, look, this is a rogue state. It's going through a leadership transition of its own. The behavior is bizarre, to say the least. It's hostile, and it's proved to be very challenging for us to manage with our allies in the region. The so-called six-party talks that are aimed at creating some type of a framework that guarantees more rational behavior from North Korea are hosted in Beijing, and you can certainly be critical, and I am as well, for China's unwillingness to really push these talks in a more effective direction.
In your comments, you talked, just shifting around the world a little bit, to Europe. You commented that Europe was cutting back. They're very concerned about default of their sovereign debt, Greece, Ireland, possibly Portugal, Spain as well. And U.S. was going in a completely different direction. We're cutting, we're extending the Bush tax cuts, or at least it's proposed. The Fed is, QE2 is trying to lower longer-term interest rates. So what's your sense here? Would you like to see the ECB policy being applied in the U.S.? Would you like to see the U.S. following the policies that Europe is now following? Is that the thrust of where, if you were sitting in Ben Bernanke's seat or in President Obama's seat, is that the direction you would go?
Aren't we out of time? That's a really tough question.
A little bit more.
but look, that's a fair point. And there are two different philosophies in the conduct of fiscal and monetary policy that are being implemented right now. There, as you very well put it, there's the European view and the U.S. view, and I think over the course of 2011, we're going to figure out that one of those is wrong. I don't think they can both be right. And I I get the point that, in a weak recovery, you don't want to tighten policy. But I think if you want to expand the stimulus, whether it's fiscal or monetary, you have to do it in the context of a framework that says, look, we are mindful of the fact that these are temporary measures that are not sustainable, and here's the framework, the game plan for the exit strategy. I don't hear that in any credible way from either the fiscal or the monetary authorities. And what I think I'm most worried about with respect to QE1, QE2, the possibility of QE3 is we're injecting a lot of liquidity into the banking system and it's not getting lent. And I think this is more of a micro than a macro problem. And I would urge the Fed to take a long and hard look at the 1.7 trillion that was QE1 and try to figure out why the bulk of it is still today on deposit in the form of excess reserves in the banking system that's not getting in the hands of small and medium-sized enterprises who are starved for credit, who do the bulk of the hiring in the United States. I think that's an important micro issue that should be addressed before we just launch another bunch of these QE ships.
Okay, so on the fiscal policy side, I mean, the argument that's being made for extending the tax cuts now is that we've got a short-term problem. We've got to deal with this short-term problem. We certainly have a horrendous long-term problem on the deficit, as we've had 2 commissions reporting in the last month on that. So could you see, or would you feel better if there were sort of a recognition that this is short-term, long-term, and you saw some action on the longer-term problem? Would you then be willing to accept the extension of the tax cuts?
Well, look, I think it's very important if we're going to do anything in the short term to provide a framework that guarantees a longer-term exit strategy. But, quite candidly, I have to say that I'm embarrassed as an American over this debate that has become so polarized and politicized, with politicians having the audacity to say that rich people need tax cuts at a time of extraordinary hardship of whatever it is, 9.8% of our workforce that's out of work, or 17% if you add in the unemployment. I would much prefer to see the bulk of the support to tax-paying Americans go to the victims of this recession and crisis, rather than to rich people who can certainly do without another tax break.
Okay, and on the monetary policy side, what the Fed says they're trying to accomplish, of course, is to lower long-term interest rates, which have gone up in the last month or so, but they may have gone up further if this hadn't happened. And second of all, they're trying to improve or increase the wealth, having a wealth effect. And of course, the stock market has gone up 19% since Bernanke gave his speech back in August. And that wealth effect is supposed to flow through to added consumption. Do you question whether those 2 channels would be effective here?
Well, look, I realize I'm sitting next to a former senior official of an August.
Well, you were at the Fed too, though.
But I was a little guy. You were a big guy, And I'm just not a fan of asset-dependent economic growth. I think that's what got us into this mess in the first place. And I really believe that the Fed, especially in the Greenspan era, looked the wrong way in recognizing the perils of leaning too hard on asset markets and on leverage to extract growth well beyond that generated by the internal income-generating capacity of the American labor market. So Bernanke and many of his senior colleagues have been pretty explicit pretty transparent, saying they're trying to recreate the asset, wealth-dependent economy and all the animal spirits that can lead to economic recovery. I think we got to be very, very careful here. To me, this is the model that really ended up with a pretty horrific train wreck once the asset markets went too far and then ultimately imploded.
Are you worried about deflation in the United States?
A little bit, yeah. I think with the core inflation rates down as low as they are, if you have another bump in the road, a shortfall in economic activity, you could get a whiff of deflation. I'm not worried about a cumulative downward spiral in the price level, given my baseline view that the economy is sort of going to plod along at a very low recovery rate. If we were to have another major recession at a low inflation rate, then I would be very worried about that.
Okay, let me ask you one last question, then we'll start taking questions from the floor. There's an op-ed piece in today's Wall Street Journal by Burt Malkiel. You probably saw it. Who's a very famous financial economist who wrote a very famous book called The Random Walk Down Wall Street. And he said, U.S. investors should be investing more of their assets in China. China's 10% of the world economy. You should have 10% of your assets invested in China, and most Americans don't. You agree with that?
I think investing in China is definitely a very important opportunity for portfolio diversification, but you got to be careful. China is just now emerging as an investable opportunity in terms of securities that we can understand, securities that are transparent, securities that are based on governance structures in companies that have any comparability with governance structures in Western companies. There are a lot of companies that are coming public in China. My company, Morgan Stanley, is very actively involved as an underwriter in many of these deals. But given the nascent state of the corporate sector in China, there are going to be a lot of these companies that fail. So for the investor to follow what Burt Malkiel is suggesting, you got to be careful. Single name bets are very risky. I think you want to take a portfolio approach, buying a China fund, recognizing that there are going to be a disproportionate share of failures along the way. There's a lot of exciting stories in China, especially the Chinese consumer, the Chinese services sector, that I am extremely enthusiastic about. But again, the single name bets that are so popular in this country, I would be cautious in China.
Okay, now we have time for questions from the floor. So we have some microphones around, and see, there's one right here.
Yes.
Could you just identify yourself, please, and then ask?
Yes, Melvin, Berlin, Chicago. With the amount of money that China has and the amount of population they have, you ever see them distributing some of that vis-a-vis a health care program, an unemployment compensation program, use of their funds? You ever see, does anybody ever talk about that, and what effect will that have upon their economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of conversation about it. Another way to put it is they save about 54% of their GDP. It's hugely excessive. And their social safety net, as I alluded to briefly in my comments, is paltry, especially for retirement income. If you add up the National Social Security Fund, the provincial Social Security funds, the private sector pensions, and divided by roughly 700 million workers in China, you get about $400 of lifetime retirement benefits per workers. They've got to boost that. And I think the initiatives in the 12th five-year plan will be an important down payment there. Another thing they've got to do is pay their workers more. The personal income that Chinese people make today, if you add it all up, it's about 42% of their economy. In America, that number is 86%. There's a lot of talk about Chinese wage inflation. I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, wage inflation means, you know, wages are rising at a rapid rate, and they are in China, but they're coming off an exceptionally low base. The government is focused on boosting that labor income share. They need to do that to support internal private consumption. So there's a lot of discussion about doing exactly what you suggested.
There's a question right up here. Ralph, would you identify yourself?
Okay. One area that's gone up a lot in the last couple of years. Ralph Wanger is my name. One of the areas gone up a lot is Chinese art. And many art auctions are now, and Chinese art are dominated by mainland Chinese, and prices have gone up from 3 to 10 times in value. Anything going on there? And would you like to compare it with Japan in the late 1980s when they had a similar art boom?
Well, there's two aspects of your question. Chinese buyers of Western art and basically Chinese contemporary art itself. Chinese buyers are showing up in a variety of asset markets around the world, from official buyers of treasuries to bidding at Sotheby's and Christie's for impressionist paintings. There's also the Chinese art market itself, which up until, I think I'm right, maybe 2 years ago was the hottest contemporary art market in the world off a low base. You know, there is a budding and growing culture of contemporary art in China that has captivated collectors all over the Western world. And you know, this was, I think, driven a lot by Chinese artists who were, up until maybe 10 years ago, really prohibited from showing their art in any public galleries. And yet, post-Cultural Revolution, there was an enormous burst of expressive creative energy that it just didn't filter out into the open, and Western collectors are catching wind of that. You know, the Chinese art market is flying. Is this Japan in the late 80s? I don't think so, but you know, your point's well taken.
I got a question over here, and then one here.
Ron Miller, Chicago. The question was asked when Secretary Paulson was here, given the great success of the Chinese economy and the present mess that we find ourselves in, whether there's any lesson that we can learn here from their experience. And I don't think he really answered the question, but I would be interested in knowing whether you would like to answer that question.
Well, I think there's one very important lesson. And it has to do with the issue of financial stability. The Chinese are scared to death of instability, whether it's instability in their labor force, in their economy, or in their financial markets. So they are very focused on building firewalls between asset markets, debt cultures, and the real economy. And they'll move quickly with a variety of measures to shield the bulk of their economy from asset markets. They know they can't eliminate bubbles. You know, equities, they've had them, property, they have them now, art, whatever. But they are determined to move quickly through a variety of regulatory and policy tools, again, to build firewalls between those bubbles and their economy. You look at what they did in April of this year. It was first very apparent to them very quickly that they had a property bubble in high-end real estate. There was a lot of multi-property speculation going on amongst domestic Chinese investors. They were buying 2, 3, 4, 5 condos and properties, and they said, no. So what they did was they dealt with loan-to-value ratios, which I wish is something that we had done in this country. They said for the first residence that you're buying, we're going to raise your down payment from 20 to 30%. If you want to buy a second home, we're going to raise the down payment from 20 to 50%. If you want to buy a third home, we're going to raise the down payment from 20 to 100%. You can buy it, but it's all cash. Multiple buying of residential property stopped. I think, again, financial stability can be very important to focus on. I wish that our own central bank had its eye much more on financial stability in the late 90s and again after the bursting of the equity bubble from 2004 to 2007. I'm not saying that's a lesson that the Chinese can teach us, but they certainly have a different approach in dealing with that goal than we appear to do in this country.
Got a question right here?
Yes, Fred Dudas, CFA, member of CFA Society. Could you address a little bit more, expand a little bit more on the investment side where you talked about investing in companies, how you see the securities markets growing in China, transparency, whether or not U.S. companies can come in and fulfill the consumption demand, or just how that'll be filled in by other companies similar to maybe the Japanese car companies coming to the United States? How do you see that unfolding?
Well, I'm not going to give you any specific company names, but I think a couple things I would say here that are very important. Number one, the Chinese are raising a lot of capital in international capital markets, taking companies public in Hong Kong, the United States, and floating these issues around the world to attract the capital of institutional investors outside of China. They've got to present an accounting framework that is transparent and that is provided on a framework that we are comfortable with in terms of Western accounting standards. And that is a very important part of the process of the globalization of Chinese finance and financial companies. And secondly, in terms of the domestic corporate structure in China, just answer your question focusing purely on services. The Chinese do not have an understanding of a services culture. And so they need joint ventures and partnership and participation with Western multinational service providers. This is an enormous opportunity for us. And people say, oh, it's difficult to do business with the Chinese. They put this restriction or that restriction on you. It is hard to do business with them. But they've got to grow services in the area of wholesale trade, retail trade, domestic transportation, supply chain logistics, hospitality and leisure. All of those industries are tiny in China relative to the population. They need to scale up. And they can only do that if they partner with those who have the experience and the scale globally in doing that. 15 years ago, Morgan Stanley, we made, at the time, a big bet for us in forming a joint venture with the China Construction Bank, and we set up the first investment bank in China. And it was hard to do, and we stuck with it, and we just sold the stake. It was announced last week, and we're moving on to a different platform. But China got out of that a preeminent global securities firm, CICC, China National Capital Corporation, that is on a par with investment banks around the region and actually around the world. And that's a lesson that's very important to them.
Steve, on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I just want to thank you for being with us today, your excellent presentation, and your fascinating conversation here as well, and answering all the questions. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mike.